If friendship is free, why does it feel like a luxury in South Africa? I genuinely believe that South Africa is experiencing a loneliness epidemic. I remember going through my feed and I saw this other content creator who was speaking about how lonely she feels and that accessing friendship and community isn't really realistic because of all the financial costs implied within this. Think about it, right? Like, aside from the actual meetup, there's transportation costs, there's your Uber, your train, the taxi, the bus. Maybe if you have a car, there's petrol. And I've also spoken to people within my own vicinity who've also mentioned how accessing friendship and community isn't that easy because of all those financial costs that are implied within it. And it somewhat feels a bit isolating, also having to explain these things to other people. It doesn't feel comfortable. And also think about this also, like the budget speech and the budget itself was announced recently. And there's also like a cost of living crisis that is also ongoing. Plus, also like the US announced global tariffs amongst to other countries also. So a lot of things aren't looking good financially, just globally, that's just a fact. And I somewhat think about how there's such a difference between how our parents speak about accessing community, how it was so easy and it wasn't as transactional. Like, just talk to your parents, your grandparents, or like older people around you, and just listen to their stories of how easy it was to access friendship and community. It was so simple. You just go outside and you meet people. Whereas now it just feels very transactional, very overly monetized, and just more so a thing of like a premium and more a luxury than it is anything else. But then I asked myself this question: what is it? Is it like a money thing? Is it a budget thing? Is it infrastructure? Is it maybe a lack of access to third spaces? Part 1. What are third spaces and their dark history? The term third spaces refers to places that aren't work, your school, or your home. Just places where you can just be and relax, and where you don't really feel the expectation to be responsible in the same way you would maybe when you're at home or at school or at work. Just a place to de-stress. This could be like a gym, a restaurant, a library, a public park, just a place to just exist. And this is a term coined by sociologist Ray Oldenburg. But I think that this term also has different significance in the South African context, especially when you think about our unique history. Before we get into all that, let's cover like the origins of like third spaces, the primary one that we think of, which is like a garden or a park. So this originates from Western Europe. And the reason why it originates from there is because that is a climate that is really good and hospitable to indigenous grass as we know it today. Because of the climate, it's nice, it's rainy, and that's where the lawn as we know today originates from. But at the same time, think about this, let's place it in context. There weren't like any like grocery stores or like places where you can just easily buy food. There weren't like any apps that you could just order food from. If you didn't farm, you didn't eat. So think about this, right? Like, for you to be willing to have a garden or a like grass space in your own property, you had to be so wealthy that you said, you know what, this year I'm not gonna farm. What I'm gonna do here, I'm gonna make it look pretty. That's like how wealthy you had to be. And think about it in that context of back then. That was like really, really wealthy. And with that being said, it was more so a thing of like accessing third space of public life. It was more so your proximity to money and wealth. Because also remember, right, you don't honestly believe that the people who own this grass are honestly gonna farm it, like also gonna take care of it. Are you mad? These are wealthy people. They don't have time for that basic labor. They had to get their indentured servants and also their employees or maybe their slaves to do it for them. And as a result, this access to open space is more so a thing of your proximity to wealth. And it's somewhat evolved also, like when you also think about colonization and slavery and how you often had an underclass who were basically providing and creating access to an upper class. And when I say this, I acknowledge that, like, and also note that colonization and slavery wasn't just a unique experience to like Black and African people, also people from Southeast Asia experiences, Irish people. That's why I also use this terminology. So that being said, it was always a thing of always providing for other people to access public life. So it was more so a thing of the haves and the have-nots. And then this also evolved somewhat when we approached apartheid South Africa. and how they were like the Group Areas Act, the Separate Amenities Act, even the pass laws. With the Group Areas Act, certain people could live in certain spaces, but that wasn't a guarantee that the government would actually provide good public life for you or good public life support. Even with separate amenities, you see those iconic images of people like having separate benches, like white or European, or maybe black or colored or Indian, whatever like that. There's different things labeled in those particular manners, because the nature of those spaces and public life was purposefully exclusionary. And this is something that has also begun to, well, it still stays within our current situation today. Because now we're in a unique experience where it's more so a thing of your access to money and to wealth, which determines your access to public life and your ability to participate within it. Because now, like, I want to give you a unique example. Have you ever been to Gauteng? If you're from Gauteng or you've ever been to Gauteng, if you've ever been to Sandton City, there's this monument there. It's called Nelson Mandela Square, and it's a really significant monument because it notes a really major time in South African history. But the thing is, right, take a closer look around that area. There isn't much public seating. It's not really a comfortable place to sit. The implication is that for you to observe this historical national like figure, you need to be willing to pay a premium. You need to be sitting in the restaurants around the statue to be able to observe this. And it isn't really welcoming. And you begin to notice like how public life is obviously transactional. For you to enjoy and observe things that people you'd ordinarily think would everyone be able to access, it's more so transactional. And it's also a thing of like, if you're not willing to pay a premium or this luxury, you can't participate. And that's just one example of one of these issues. Part 2, commercialization of public spaces. Before I begin, I just want to preface with the fact that the issue of public spaces and public life has been ongoing. I just mentioned in the history, this is like years in the making. But at the same time, the issue of our current economic crisis is one that has also made this bubble into something a lot bigger. But at the same time, this issue of public spaces, if we don't intervene now, will continue to exist even after this moment. So basically, two things can be true at once, that our need for public spaces is real and valid, and that also the current economic situation does worsen this need and this need for community. So that being said, I note that a lot of people, because like there isn't that much infrastructure or ability to access public life and public society, often turn to commercialized spaces like restaurants, cafes, and just different spaces like maybe museums, etc., just to feel connected and just to de-stress from work, school, or home. But as a result, you also begin to see like this is expensive. What about just going to a park and a garden? Thing is, right, I remember I used to live in Joburg. Those places were not well maintained and they weren't really like secure, and you don't really feel comfortable just going there easily. So as a result, many people turn to privatized spaces because A, there's a guarantee of security, but at the same time, you're able to somewhat enjoy it and not feel uncomfortable in the same way that you would maybe if the space isn't well maintained or unsafe, etc. But at the same time, you also begin to note how a lot of these spaces are purposefully hostile if you don't have money or are not willing to spend a premium. Like, have you ever been to a mall when you didn't have money? That's crazy. It's hard. It's very difficult, and it somewhat feels dehumanizing, like you don't belong there. Even that experience that I just mentioned about Nelson Mandela Square also, about how the space is not inviting. You're not really invited to stay there for long. It's more so if you don't have money, move. Get out of here. Like, take your picture and leave. And I think about how even like general overall infrastructure, like public infrastructure, is purposefully hostile from people just being able to just sit there and enjoy the environment. Like even you look at benches that are purposefully designed to be hostile for different spaces or walkways, purposefully have infrastructure to make it inhospitable, you know. But I do understand like also people mitigating from loitering and such like that, but that's also a very thin line and a very debatable line. But also at the same time, right, I'm not going to like dismiss how a lot of commercialized spaces have a lot of impact. I'm not saying they should just be abolished and disappear, whatever like that. They have a lot of real value. They offer a lot of economic value. They provide jobs. And most times people are just local, everyday people who just decide to start a business and wanted to invest within their own community. And I'm not dismissing that. But I think that there's also a careful balancing act where people should also still be able to just access general life and not feel like they're unwelcome just because they don't have money. And I think it also ties into that thing of many people feeling lonely because going out means you have to have money. And especially in a country where we have like over 40% unemployment rate, that's not really realistic. Another thing to also think in mind, right? Like as much as you're going to commercialized spaces, there's only so many times you can have coffee. There's only so many times you can watch a movie. Only so many times you can maybe go to a restaurant. There's only so many times you can do those things or have lunch, brunch, etc. Sometimes it's okay to just want to just chill, relax after work, not go home to your kids, or maybe not go home immediately to like being with your family, just or not just being at work or at school, just a place just to relax, catch your breath, and just be yourself maybe. That's all that people want. Part 3. The abandonment of cities. I remember when I used to live in Joburg, I once heard this phrase that Joburg is not a place for love or enjoyment, it's a place for business. And I honestly relate to that so much. So I remember when I lived in Joburg, there was this primary school that used to be near where I live. And I'd hear the kids walking home from school, like laughing, having fun, just having a good time. And obviously, like they're little kids, like it's a primary school around like 2 o'clock and 3 p.m. But at the same time, I remember when I once actually looked outside my window, like I was like, wait a minute, these kids are coming home from their place, like coming from school, from their place of mental nourishment, enjoyment, and also just being fulfilled. And as they're walking home, they're coming across needles on the road. They'd be ladies of the night. I thought to myself, how did that also like act on your psyche? How does that also impact you as a person when you're seeing this contradictory image? You know, how does that affect you? And I also experienced that like oftentimes when people live in inhospitable places like cities as they are structured today, they don't want to stay there long. It actually somewhat limits productivity, and people somewhat view these city centers as places to establish themselves and move on. And I also wonder, like, how does this also affect the sustainability of these places? So when I used to live in Joburg, I also lived in town. And I found it very difficult to somewhat access community, and I somewhat felt a little bit frustrated and a little bit lonely. Because for you to go out and experience the world, you had to think about a lot of stuff. Safety was a big one. Like also debating, like, am I going to leave my phone at home? Like, how am I going to dress? A lot of factors like that, and just felt like it wasn't really feasible for me to go out, and just felt like way too much of an inconvenience. And I think about how COVID, like the Rona, also affected our ability to also go out, and how a lot of us have begun to depend on social media to connect to different people and have begun to like pull ourselves inward. And that right now there's a real hunger for community, and that when you also have cities and different areas that aren't really well maintained, that people begin to view them as places of not longevity and meaningful life being lived there, but as places of just coming and going. And I wonder, how does this also affect that long-term sustainability? How does this affect how people view and interact with one another in these places, the values, etc.? And how does it also overall impact the city planning? Because, you know, city planning is a really critical aspect in terms of how you organize a society, what values you would like to evoke. And when people don't feel welcome, how does it affect like work productivity? How does it affect people willing to stay, economic productivity, longevity, etc.? Part 4, the rest of the country. So I know I've spoken a lot about like city centers, city life, but South Africa has 9 provinces and there are like 60 million people there. And the unique experiences that affect people living in cities is very different from people living elsewhere. So I think about my own personal experience, like living in Venda, how a lot of things are also changing there. There's a lot of commercialized development that is occurring within there. But I also ask myself, like when spaces are becoming increasingly commercialized, how does this also affect the fabric of communities? How does it affect access to third spaces and meaningful city planning? Are people just going to refer to these places as places where they can interact? And how does this also like affect the overall fiber of these spaces and these communities? And at the same time, I think about a unique experience even in Cape Town, how many people are experiencing a housing crisis and many people are being priced out of accessing community and priced out of living in decent places. I remember I came across this couple on my feed. They were talking about how they just got married. They live in Cape Town. And one of their biggest struggles is money. And that it's really difficult to build a life when you don't even have guarantee of where you can live. And also this issue of public life and public city planning, etc., is very nuanced, and it changes in each context that you're in. So I know my experience is these three examples of city centers like Joburg, Limpopo, and also in Cape Town are very unique. It's also an ongoing conversation that also impacts other provinces. And I think it also changes when you look at different contexts. And I think about this, like, should we also just be prioritizing how commercialized our spaces have become? Or should we also be looking at the long-term values and aspects we'd want to evoke? Having people who are happier living in our country, people who enjoy being here, people who aren't just burdened by stress, like protecting our people, protecting our citizens. And that's a really big question that I also think about. And maybe, what do you think? The final part. So far, I've just been making complaints. But let's discuss some solutions. I think about effective city planning, how there isn't much effective city planning, being intentional with how things are organized and how we can protect the interests of South Africans. That's a big thing I think of, even when you think about the Cape Town housing crisis, even like infrastructure in big cities, even in Limpopo, the case study there. Another thing I think about is policing, how there isn't enough safety in these spaces, how people feel scared, like to also go out and engage public life. I think those are the big ones for me. Also, like the economic crises, like effectively planning for that, how people are able to spend money and feeling protected and comfortable doing so. I don't know, let's discuss. Let me know what you think, how to resolve this. And yeah, these are just some thoughts, my own experiences, and also some of my own research. Yeah, I'll see you next time. Bye.